Adrian N. Breitfelder, City Clerk, you are hereby directed to call a special session of the City Council to be held on Monday, March 17th, 2025 at 5:15 p.m. in the Historic Federal Building for the purpose of conducting a work session on the Schmidt Island Development and Sports Complex Feasibility Study.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to a special session of the Dubuque City Council for March 17th, 2025. As a reminder to viewers and listeners, due to the nature of tonight's meeting topic, public input is not accepted. However, you may contact the City Council directly from the city's webpage at www.cityofdubuque.org/council contacts. Attendance for the session is as follows. Mayor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Council members Farber.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Resnick.
Here.
Roussel.
Here.
Sprank.
Here.
Wethel.
Here.
City Manager Van Milligan. And City Attorney Brumwell.
Here.
Thank you. Our work session topic is the public presentation of the Schmidt Island Development and Sports Complex Feasibility Study. I will turn it over to RDG Planning and Design's Ryan Peterson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners, Mike, City staff, Brian Rakestraw. I'm the Chief Operating, Chief Financial Officer, and Interim President and CEO for Dubuque Racing Association, so kind of a mouthful right now. But thank you all. I want to say thank you for having this. It's a very important topic for us and I think for the community. But as I think everybody realizes is that the Dubuque Racing Association, with a partnership with the City of Dubuque, we are doing a $100 million investment on the Schmidt Island. Majority of that is what we call on the Q Casino side. But as we look at that, we look at the entire island and we look at the actual baseball fields, we look at the Imon Arena, which we're currently managing, and we like, what's the art of possibility? What else can we do? And we look at sports from a standpoint of tournaments, activities, what can really spur economic growth for our community. Even though we run a casino, even though we have a sports book, we are not experts when it comes to sports. So with we partnered with Dubuque Initiatives, and we hired RDG to do a feasibility study for us. That feasibility study was shared with our board back in early January, and our board unanimously approved to donate that to the City of Dubuque to see however y'all want to use that. So today I want to introduce Ryan Peterson with RDG, and he will basically introduce his team, and he will give that presentation to you.
All right. Well, good evening. As Brian said, I'm Ryan Peterson, and we're grateful for the opportunity to share an update to the Schmidt Island Development Master Plan as it relates to the feasibility of a sports complex. And I've been here before, and so I'm going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Tom Oley, who is a sports architect, and then to Brandon Dowling to introduce themselves.
Good evening. Thanks for having us. As Ryan said, Tom Oley. I'm a sports architect, help head up our national sports market within RDG. We're about 30 strong, and we do work really coast to coast on all varieties from academic or athletics within campuses as well as community work, big to small, sort of from the rec side of things to the big stadia side of things. So really excited to be here. Thanks.
Good evening. Brandon Dowling. I'm with Johnson Consulting. Our role was the market financial feasibility and economic impact consultant. Just a little bit about Johnson. This is what we do. We specialize in public assembly type facilities throughout the U.S. We're based out of Chicago. Been in business for about 29 years. I lead our sports and entertainment practice. I've been with the company for about 17. So look forward to sharing our findings with you tonight. Thank you.
All right, so we'll try to keep ourselves on track here. We know we have about an hour, or actually probably a little bit less than that. So tonight's agenda, as many of you have probably seen, number one, we're going to share a little bit about what led us here today based on the DRA and the Dubuque Initiative scope that we were hired to complete. We'll share some feedback from the stakeholders, some of whom are in the room, the more than 2,000 people that responded to our survey. Brandon will walk us through the bulk of the market overview, the national trends, and then we're going to touch on some of the analysis that we completed as it relates to Schmidt Island. And then ultimately, Tom will take us through some of the facility designs that have been put together. Again, we really want to thank all of you as partners, as collaborators. There was a lot that went into this, and you can see those individuals and organizations listed here on the screen. Again, just stressing 2,031 individuals took the survey, and that was this past fall of 2024. So that number says a lot to us, knowing that we had 2,000 different interested parties really underscores the excitement and energy around this topic. So thank you to all of those that may be listening or have taken the survey. So the background, the why are we doing this? Not here to read all of the words on the screen, but I think this phrase here sums it up well. Improving the quality of life for all of Dubuque citizens. So this was focused on both the community recreation side, we talked a little bit about that, but ultimately the objective of this study was to look at the potential from a sports tourism standpoint. So we'll walk that tightrope tonight. We understand the city's moving forward with a Parks and Recreation master plan that would complement this, but we're here looking at ways in which we can increase visitation to the community. And then ultimately, I think on the next slide here, Mr. Rick Dickinson underscores that in terms of creating a community of first choice. And we appreciate, Rick, your contributions and input as we pulled this study together. I'm going to flip back here. We did talk a little bit about, Brandon mentioned the market assessment, and again, we're really looking at what is the potential for what could take place in Dubuque, and then we went through that further and looked at what could take place on Schmidt Island. So there's kind of two things here that we're juggling, and you'll see where those recommendations come out. And then ultimately looking at ways in which we could create a program or a strategy that could be supported and operated, and I think Brandon will hit on that here in a moment. And so with that, Brandon, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk us through some of the stakeholder comments and feedback.
Thank you, Ryan. So the next few slides, we're going to kind of walk through our methodology and the process of which we had taken to complete our analysis. At the very beginning of our study, we had several different local stakeholders that we met with in focus group fashion to really kind of understand, what are the needs here locally, what are the gaps in the community as they're seeing, and as you're seeing on the screen, these are sort of the key themes that resonated from that initial visit with a lot of the sports organizations, the schools, and the city representatives to really further understand, what is the early opportunity here. At the very onset, it was very clear that there was a significant gap in sports facility infrastructure here. In talking with the schools and some of the local community event facilities being at max capacity, opening the dates for renting and selling out, within a day. Some of those anecdotals that we learned were really evident that there is a really strong need and desire here locally, in particular for the multi-purpose indoor. There seem to be a lot of various parties in that regard that were interested. There was a significant need and desire for sports tourism. There appeared to be a lot of third-party, sort of public-private partnership opportunities with a lot of these various organizations. And there was also, from the early onset, an understanding that this could be an economic development recruitment standpoint for the community, a quality of life asset that you all can be proud of in terms of its ability to really retain and recruit families and businesses here. And then the other is and I don't want to downplay this, I think it's most important, is we think it's going to be sort of a paradigm shift to what you guys are having right now, right? The local community is really, understanding of sort of renting and utilizing the facilities that you are today at a fairly discounted rate, right? And so what we're talking about is a new state-of-the-art type facility that we think is really strong demand here locally, but it is going to be somewhat of a different paradigm, if you will, from what you all are doing here today. I'll speak briefly about sort of the market demographic data that we analyzed. One of the things that we noted is sort of moving forward, the reduction in population, right? And sort of getting our arms around where that is here locally. But the most important thing in that regard that we found is the importance of this being a regional type facility. Not only did we learn that there's significant demand here locally, which is great, but we also learned that there's a regional demand that is also seeking this type of asset as well. One of the encouraging things is when you look at the median household income, it is projected to grow. And the map on the right is, we broke down a lot of the data that you'll see in a 30-minute, 90-minute, and a 240. Those are your three catchment areas. 30-minute is your primary. That's your Monday through Thursday demand. And what we've seen nationally is that's sort of the threshold that mom, dad, caretaker are willing to travel from Monday through Thursday for those games and practices and things of that nature. When you start to go to the 90 and the 240, That is a little bit more on the, weekday or weekend, smaller regional type tournaments. There will be a day trip. They'll come for the tournament all day and then leave. That 240 threshold is where you usually start to see more of the overnight visitors. That's a larger regional tournament, national tournament, and so they're staying here in the market and sort of spending their money. So those dollars that you see is where you all fall in each of those catchment areas relative to the national index for recreational and sports spend. So a little bit lower than the national average, as you can see. But again, we attribute some of that to the lack thereof of facilities here in the market as well. I briefly touched on the population trends. I think one of the things that I will point out is that we thought was a significant strength here as well is sort of the regionality and draw that you all have, the population and density base that you can pull from. Again, up to 20 million people within a 4-hour drive. And when you start to look at that relative to the supply and demand opportunity within that, it really becomes a strong opportunity in our opinion. This is just more information on sort of the trends in medium household income and disposable income used for sporting events. These are very important to us to understand the propensity of the market to really support these types of initiatives, right? And so we really do a deeper dive into where the income is, where the disposable income, and how are they spending that. And again, we look at that through more of a catchment of those three markets that we discussed. Again, slightly below the national average, but again, I think that's attributing to the limited supply of offerings. One of the most important things that we look at for particularly sports tourism type facilities is hotel infrastructure. Frankly, we call it sports, tourism infrastructure in general. One of the big points are accessibility, hotel infrastructure, family entertainment in and around or nearby. These are things that will help support a facility of this type, but also enhance the experience for the user groups that may be coming. Again, looking at the hotel inventory, we look at not only the occupancy levels to see where they at sit today, but the ADR, average daily rate for hotels. This becomes important as, in particular in this industry, as it starts to become more competitive for these types of tournaments and host tournaments. The spend that's being recruited or requested really from the families is growing significantly, not only from a participation standpoint, but also from the travel standpoint. So when we look at your ADR and we see that it's about 120, that's actually a strength of your market. I think it's an affordable price when you start to compare that to some of your competition, in particular within that 4-hour drive. So again, looking at areas that we think could be really helpful for you all as you begin to recruit with a venue of what's being proposed today. The next wave of our analysis really, you'll see we did baseball diamonds, softball diamonds, soccer, ice, indoor courts. And so we did regional audits across these same catchment areas we talk about. The diagram on the bottom right, you kind of see sort of the larger notable facilities within that catchment area. So this is baseball, softball, and looking at some of the competition in and around those cohorts of markets. The largest being most noted is the Prairie Ridge with 17. Closest is the Prospect Meadows venue. And then, when we start to look at what is here locally, again, a smaller inventory, if you will, in terms of some of the baseball, softball. When we start to talk about regional type sports tourism venues, obviously everything that's being proposed with the Field of Dreams and Dyersville is something that we analyze as well. The next is indoor courts. Again, this was sort of that biggest gap within the marketplace outside of TBK. You start to look at some of these other facilities that are, outside of that 90-minute more in that 240. So, you can see the cluster, and I should have referenced this earlier. The size of the circle gives the size of the venue. So the larger the circle, the larger the venue. Now you can see primarily a lot of those are in and around Chicagoland area or northwest suburbs or Milwaukee, or Madison. Particularly to your northwest, there's really quite a gap, if you will, relative to indoor infrastructure here regionally. Looked at what we call multi-purpose. This is your soccer, lacrosse, football type fields. Again, looking at this with the lens of sports tourism, we look at the largest facilities within those catchment areas. Again, a lot of these are more aligned in those larger metropolitan areas where there's larger swaths of land and 30-plus fields within those markets, right? And so, again, this is an area that we've learned a lot about in terms of, the usage here locally at some of the schools, and obviously you have the local soccer complex as well. The other is ice. So we looked at Iman Arena, again, looking at that relative to a lot of the regional. I think the largest was the Graham, that's in Rochester, Minnesota. So a little bit further removed than that 90-minute, but within that 90-minute, there's very limited competition for this particular surface type, right? And so to us, this is another one of those lowest hanging fruits for you all in terms of demand and opportunity, not only just here locally from a participation standpoint, but also from a supply and demand standpoint. We included a snapshot of the calendar, if you will, at IMON, just to really kind of show the volume of events that are happening there. It is a very well-utilized facility today, and adding on new tenants and really from a gender equity standpoint, there's some improvements that need to be happening there as well. And so, in our opinion, this is, as we get to a little bit of our recommendations, we think an additional surface will really help ameliorate some of that, as well as increase opportunity. In the ice business, there's prime time and non-prime time. It's sort of based on the time and day that you're allowed to use the ice. And so, in our opinion, an additional surface would really open up additional more prime time from a revenue standpoint, could be advantageous to the ongoing operations. Next, we looked at national trends. One of the things that I'll just sort of call out here in terms of the graph on the right, this is dating back from 2012. You may note that we finally started to see an uptick in total participation, so about 136 million kids are playing sports, in particular team sports. One of the things I want to call attention to is that orange line, and this is what we attribute to the specialization of sports. As you can see, it's been slightly declining over time, right? And this is a part of what we're seeing nationally is the specialization of sports. On one hand, it's sort of buying down the overall participants. So when I was younger, I played 5 sports. Whatever the sport was in season, I played it, and I counted as 5 people. But nowadays, if I were to be playing, I would play baseball, and I'd be playing baseball year-round. And so, a lot of that has really decreased the overall participation, but it's also enhanced the need for these types of facilities for a year-round basis, right? And so, to us, this is where we start to see really the opportunity for these types of venues nationally. We looked at the trends for all sports, and again, mind you, these are national averages for the last 3 years. Again, looking at the various sports that we'd analyzed, noting that baseball, softball, and football were sort of the ones that sort of seen a decline. We've seen a lot of strength in and around ice and figure skating, and particularly volleyball and cheer. One anecdotal thing I'll have here that we have in the bigger report, one of the things that we found from a sports tourism and travel standpoint is girls' sports in particular often bring more of a party to the particular events and tournaments. So, and so we're not really surprised to kind of see the participation levels rise in that regard. And so volleyball in particular and cheer, we're seeing, typically it'd be mom, brother, sister, dad, and now it's grandma, grandpa, and it's the whole sort of family that are coming along with some of these. And so it's just an interesting thing that we're seeing on a national level as you start to look at these types of facilities, in particular one that you're trying to hope and gain more regional attendance and spend in your community. You can really sort of start to focus on particular sports that will drive that in a greater degree. This is sort of our secret sauce. This is we analyzed the population, those national rates, and we have a database from doing this the last 20 plus years that we've really created sort of a proprietary, what we call a market penetration rate, and it's a basis and derivative of the number and supply of facilities with that particular sport in the market relative to the population and the population growth and the national rates within that sport. So from there, we're really able to attribute a projected sort of demand relative to number of athletes. This isn't sort of total demand for the facilities. Those athletes would go to the facility, 10 plus times a year, if you will. So this is really just looking at the number of athletes in a particular area, how well you're doing today in capturing them versus what would, if those improvements that were suggested, what you could get in terms of a variance from what you're doing today, right? And so, just looking at this, we're projecting about 30,000 new athletes, if you will, to the facility, and it may not be, I want to recharacterize that, not new athletes, but being able to attain 30,000 athletes to the community that may be going elsewhere today, is really what that's encapturing. I'm going to pass it off to Ryan to talk about some of the public input survey.
Don't go too far. All right. I mentioned earlier the 2,000 respondents that participated in the survey. When we looked at the breakdown of them, 5% of those individuals were representatives or an administrator or a director of a club. 52% of them currently play right now. They identified in terms of being an active sports participant. And then the other 43% were area residents in the community that might be interested, would like to play. Maybe they have younger children that aren't quite of age yet, but that's what that category represents. You can also see here the breakdown in terms of the respondents, and I think as you talk about talent and keeping or recruiting talent, in particular, these two brackets right here kind of stood out to us. You can see that 57% of the people that took this survey were 34 to 44. So many of you here and in the room would fall into that and may have youth that are participating in some of these activities, traveling out of Dubuque, et cetera. Also on the right, you can see where they came from. So the majority of the respondents did come from a Dubuque-based zip code or an Asbury zip code, but we also had some pretty good participation from Piasta and the surrounding areas for those that took this. On this slide here, we've captured just a few of the questions. Overwhelmingly, those that took this are clearly interested in sports, so about 84% of those individuals declared that their needs are not being met. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we had such great participation in terms of the quantity of survey takers. And then when you look at the growth potential for some of those organizations, 68% of them indicated that their club or sport was going to be growing in the future. What we like to do, and as Brandon looks at the national data and the regional trends, we can use this as a benchmark to look at those areas where they overlap to right size what the local demand may be for local or regional use. So that's how this information is used for us as we go about making decisions. This question here, do you leave the region for suitable facilities? And you can see that on a weekly to monthly basis, of those that identified as being a sports participant or a resident, there was a significant number of respondents that are leaving on a weekly basis. In fact, that's the highest number of the highest count. And keep in mind, sometimes in a survey, we didn't require them to respond to this, so they may have skipped it and decided they weren't interested in responding. And then lastly, just in terms of the frequency of participation, you can see here the darker the blue means more frequent, blue means very frequent, and then occasional use. So very frequent is 100 plus times in the past 12 months. 50 to 100 times would be this color here, and then the lighter blue would be less than 50. Soccer has a very high frequency in terms of use, at least those that took our survey, followed closely by hockey, baseball, volleyball, softball, basketball. We did have a number of questions that were more along the lines of community recreation, and fishing was one of those that scored very high, and we see that often, especially with river towns or communities that are next to water, as being a very frequent use. And then as we go on further down here, football, gymnastics, kind of what I'll say picked up that kind of top tier of use, or frequency, I should say. So what does that mean? I think, Brandon, you want to talk a little bit about the distinction here in terms of what that means for this project and study?
Thank you, Ryan. So Ryan talked a little bit about this earlier. We go back to sort of definition of success when we first started this study and what we were doing and what we were charged to analyze. And first and foremost, it was really to analyze what is the market demand opportunity here in Dubuque to really understand, whether or not it's indoor turf, indoor basketball courts, ice, baseball, softball, multi-purpose soccer, rectangle. As I just shared, that was sort of what drove a lot of our analysis, right? And then the next was to really look at sports tourism opportunity here in Dubuque. When we talk about sports tourism, the one thing I was remiss in sharing earlier is there are certain thresholds in terms of quantity of types of these surfaces that really would make you an attractive sports tourism hub, if you will, right? And so there's really minimums that you really need to have if you're even able to compete in the tournament market, right? And so, one of the things that we understood pretty quick in terms of the opportunity and demand is that there was a pretty good demand across the board for types of new facilities here, not only locally but regionally. But when we start to look at some of the sports tourism aspect, one of the ones that sort of, as you could see in the check mark, didn't really make it in that regard is the indoor multi-purpose. Although there may be a need here locally, to get to that level and quantity, you need at least 2 to 3 of those indoors, and that becomes a pretty sizable proposition, and sort of when we look at really the low-hanging fruit and opportunity that you all had, we thought that really didn't really make a lot of sense in terms of a recommendation for sports tourism. The next was then looking at Schmidt Island, what we were sort of in charge to look at, how and which one of these low-hanging fruits, if you will, would make most sense on Schmidt Island. And so in part of our recommendations, it was the multi-purpose indoor courts. Again, that could be basketball, volleyball, cheer, gymnastics, and it's year-round. One of the things that we know is the weather and sort of the year-round variability of that. And so when you start looking at the ability to host sports tourism type of events, the ability to have that opportunity year-round is important to the overall success for that type of facility. And the next is really the ice, right? And we noted, and that's really further leveraging what you all have right now in that asset of one sheet and adding a second to really help differentiate yourself from the region and really become a supportive venue for hockey tournaments, figure skating, and things of that nature. So now we've analyzed the market, we've heard the feedback from the local community on the public surveys, we've made our sort of recommendation based on all that data. We started to dive into sort of comparative markets of either similar size or scale relative to population or density near major population bases, and that have similar to what we're suggesting in terms of these types of facilities, really to learn and either best practices or lessons learned from these communities relative to their ability to support these types of facilities. We begin to start analyzing this from more of a market demographic standpoint, again, to really understand, can Dubuque really support something of what we're suggesting and how is it being done elsewhere? As I talked about earlier, the need for regional basis of this type facility, when we start to look at you all from a 90-minute standpoint relative to the other facilities that we analyzed in Appleton, Bettendorf, in West Des Moines, you're right around average or slightly above it in a lot of the key categories that we look at. As you talk about sort of the household spend and where you are and the median household income, those are pretty strong indicators that there is an ability to really support this over and above the lack thereof supply here regionally. We also started to look at some statistics around these visitations. So we use a platform called Placer AI. It's a geofencing software that really can track through cell phones to really understand, some of the visitation numbers we're still a little bit skeptical of in terms of its tracking at these venues. But one of the things that we do feel strong about is its ability to track the origin of the visitor and the time that they're spending at these facilities. Those are two really important indicators because as we start to look at this, you'll see the notion of the percent of non-local. So that, in our mind, would call overnight visitor. Non-local is defined as 100 miles plus from the facility. So that percentage of the visitation for each of these, if you look at TBK or Mid-America, it's double digits and it's in the 20s, right? And that's an indicator that it's creating that regional overnight draw that you would want in a sports tourism facility. So currently, when we analyze that, it's about 6%, right? And that, that shouldn't surprise anyone. It's more of a local draw, right? It's not overnight visitors. And so the notion is here, this would sort of help flip that script a little bit, increase that 6% to a 20%. And now you have more spend in footfall and all the visitation that an indoor multipurpose rink and ice could do for your market. Then we did a interesting analysis at those facilities, and we looked in particular to the zip codes for Dubuque. So how many folks here are leaving and going to these venues? And so you can see a pretty significant amount of visitation. Obviously, probably no surprise in Bettendorf. We heard that a lot early on, that's where a lot of folks are going, right? And so that makes a lot of sense. Somewhat surprised to see some of the others at the volume that we did see, right? And so it's just another indicator that there's leakage for this type of sports tourism, if you will, here locally. I'm going to pass it off to Tom. All right.
Both of us. So earlier I mentioned the Schmidt Island Development Plan, which we were in front of you probably 6 to 9 months ago to review that. This analysis diagram here goes to show how a potential sports complex on Schmidt Island would make sense. And we call this a flight map. It shows where all the adjacent amenities are. And I think that's one of the key things that Brandon shared with us. That was, an ideal component or attribute, I should say, of Schmidt Island, and that you have a family entertainment center right next door. You've got the opportunity for outdoor recreation on the water. You're not too far from Heritage Trail. You are well positioned to potentially have people stay here and then play at the Field of Dreams. And so when you think about the adjacency and you think about the amenities that this community offers, and more specifically on Schmidt Island, we like to make sure that we think about that, because it might give this site a competitive advantage over others. It really comes down to what that operational strategy would be as you move forward. But with that, I wanted to have Tom kind of walk us through the different scenarios that we went through.
So what does this facility look like, or what could it look like? We sort of backed up a little bit from what Brandon has shared and looked a little holistically. Again, we want to play out all the different scenarios and not just rely on those core data points. We also want to look a little subjectively at things. So there were really 6 scenarios that played out. We used a grading criteria that, again, focused in on the data points, which were leading us to the ice and court facility, but also looked at those subjective things. Again, we heard so much about soccer and baseball and softball, how critical those are to the Dubuque community. Didn't want to just downcast those right from the start, so we played those up in our scenarios and looked at things. First scenario was sort of our base model. What if we held pat? What if we did nothing? Where would that put us? Again, really kept us at our current state as our population lowers a little bit. Household income goes up a little bit, we remain pretty much dead level there. And then we looked at a court sport facility along with a McAleese baseball, softball complex. Didn't quite hold the water we were looking for. Again, as Brandon described, you've got to have that critical mass of field facilities to really have that tourism draw. Could this pair with a Field of Dreams or another facility? It most certainly could, but was it the core revenue generation key aspect for Schmidt Island? Didn't hit all those notes. The court sports started to do that, though. We could partner that with the Imon Arena, get some shared interoperability, get a little bit of the utility savings, create that new hub right at the entrance to Schmidt Island. So it started to hit some of those nodes for us. And then we went deep into the field side of things. What could we really do to play that up? Again, I've sort of hit on this, just didn't hold the water. We're not generating the number of fields we need to support those sports tourism market. So then we thought a little bigger. We thought about the indoor practice facility. Brandon already sort of talked through that wasn't a viable option, but we wanted to see how it could play out, and so we did just that. Looking at an indoor softball complex, when you talk sports tourism, that's really where you're going to generate your money on an indoor practice facility. Again, just couldn't hold the weight there. But from this concept, we started to think again about the ice. What could that look like? Could we start to bring that to the Imon Arena like we had partnered with the basketball and court sports? Let's think about ice. So then we started to really develop it a little bit more. I'm going to skip, for the interest of time, skip to sort of where we ended up, which was Concept F. Really looked at that ice facility, focused around Imon, getting you those 2 ice rinks that really benefit from the catchment area, which we know we have that little bit of a deficit within that 90-minute bubble. We can draw all those people in, and then we can play up that court facility. Draw all that gender equity that we're looking to do, provide all the volleyball, basketball, wrestling, cheerleading, gymnastics, create that core hub of activity. And then in this concept, we started to think about McAleese a little differently. We felt like it could be unto itself, become something for the college and universities to play upon, to create their sort of core hub of baseball or softball, but wouldn't be critical to the sports tourism market. So that's ultimately sort of where we ended up, an amalgam of B, E, which ultimately blended us to arrive at F. Creates that wow factor as you arrive onto the island, aligns with the core development plan, which we know is so critical to being successful for the island, and then draws upon all the data that Brandon is really bringing to the table to make this a rich facility. So from a design standpoint, again, as I sort of talked about, it's that wow factor. We want to create that impact. If we looked at the pieces that were back on McAleese, they get a little lost behind things. As we bring the folks to the fore, we're floating really above Dubuque, looking back toward Illinois this way, or looking toward the east. We create that wow, new point of entry as we arrive on the island. And then as we come inside, we can start to play up all that vibrancy, play up all the multifunctionality from our sort of Monday to Thursday users, along with our college and universities and their teams, along with our sports tourism pieces playing out those weekends. And then that court sports facility, providing that gender equity, providing that balance, providing all the great multitude of activities that folks can see and be seen as they participate. So from a plan perspective, started to lay those pieces out. Again, critical there is number one, that's the core IMON arena, and then we sort of build from there. We started to test out how that would work. We've started to think about a sort of a core parking strategy. Again, there's going to need to be a lot of operations. We're just thinking initially about what the parts and pieces are. There's the whole world of Schmidt along with Q Casino that needs to be considered as we start to develop this. But these were those critical masses that made the court sport and the ice rink so beneficial. So for them, from a feasibility, looking at the core components within the building, again, the ice facility focused around providing resources for each one of your institutions if they wanted to partner with this facility, providing the right number of locker rooms to support 2 ice sheets operating at the same time, men's as well as women's, and then your core home team, and then that court sport facility focusing around all those families rolling through there, making sure they can see their participants, their kiddos playing the activities, and then make sure you have those food and beverage amenities to support your revenue model. So from a cost perspective, again, we're very conceptual right now. So big picture, really thought of it from a low to high perspective. So we're talking about 75,000 square feet on the ice facility side. That puts us in right around the $22 to $32 million mark, depending on the finish level. A lot of variables here that we need to work through as we build this forward, but again, that's sort of what's supported within those revenue models. And then from a court sport facility, focusing on that just south of 60,000 square feet, a little lower price points there, again, because we're focusing in on court sports, not the ice sheet, comes in right around that $17 to $25 million. So that was the core design. Brandon?
Thanks, Tom. We also did a sort of economic impact analysis of the suggested program. We did it as an ongoing annual basis for each of the proponents, as well as a one-time construction impact. You will note these are year 5 numbers. We attribute that to be the stabilization year, so it takes a little bit for these facilities to get ramped up in terms of programming. On the ice facility, we're projecting just about $4.5 million in total spend, and on the multipurpose court venue, about $14.3 million. And combined, again, if both were to be executed, about $18.8 million on an ongoing annual basis. That's an economic impact to the community. For in particular, just sports tourism events. And then when we look at a one-time, again, talking about some of those construction numbers that Tom had just gone through, looking at the hard cost and sort of arriving at what the total direct spend impact would be here locally. The ice facility would be at 14.4. The court would be at about 10.2, and in combined, just about 25 million at 24.6 for a total hard cost of 48 million. And then I will pass it off. I know we're getting short here on time. I want to leave time for questions.
All right, so wrapping up here, one of the things that I just wanted to also call attention to was Tom made a comment about parking. Within a development plan, we did work with Walker Parking, and they analyzed Schmidt Island primarily from an event standpoint. So we know that when there's a hockey game going on right now at Imon, or when there is a concert, you do have parking challenges. And one of the things that we would recommend is working through an operational strategy, thinking through if you've got 2,000 spaces on the island right now, with some new spaces coming online, and you have 3 people per car, you should have capacity to park upwards of 6,000 people. Now, will it happen all at once? No. And that's where the operational plan comes into place. And to some degree, those places that you visit when you travel somewhere that are in highest of demand usually have a little bit of a parking friction. And so that's certainly something that will need to be addressed as this plan moves forward into the operational components. But just wrapping up here, clearly I think as Johnson has identified, there is a clear demand both locally and regionally, and can't emphasize the regionality enough in terms of increasing that access to the spend level that the 90-minute radius brings about. I mentioned the scale in terms of being right-sized and having that appeal for the regional aspects. The economics, Brandon mentioned that. The adjacent amenities, we talked about that in terms of leveraging what you have on the island and making sure that this kind of completes the puzzle, if you've got a lot of critical mass on the north side, this connects the south side, and now you've got an island as a whole that is moving forward, helping to further impact the economic opportunity on the south end. Equity from a sports standpoint in terms of women in sport, and making sure that they have facilities that will be on par or better than their male counterparts, and then looking at ways in which it could be funded. And funding is one of the biggest challenges, as we all know, and it's going to take a focus team that is committed to seeing this happen. And there's going to need to be, probably some iterations. This is a starting point. It's not the end point. But I think what it does demonstrate is that there is an opportunity here that is viable. And so with that, we'd like to thank you for the time to present this, and we look forward to taking any questions you might have.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you very much. We have a good 20 minutes, so just so everybody at the desk knows, we're going to stop around 6:15 so we can make the switch over with computers and all that good stuff, so keep that in mind. Let me first say, because I don't want this to get lost in the discussion as we just pepper you with questions, but thank you to everybody who was involved in this. Let's start with the DRA. Thank you very much for putting this forward and then making it as a donation to the city to be able to have it community-wide so we can have this discussion really as a full community. And then to our RDG and Johnson, I mean, this is the second time that I've seen this. A couple different presentations that you gave. You gave one at for DRA and for the community at Schmidt Island. And I think, this is just some really good work, and I think it gives us a great place to be able to have this discussion more fully. There's some really good ideas in here. It's good to see the different possibilities, and you gave us, I really appreciated the scenarios the most, to be able to see like, okay, what is this gonna actually look like if we do it this way? What's the return on the investment gonna be? There's some really important questions that we need to answer as we get through this conversation more fully. Not tonight, I mean the full conversation, just as a community. But clearly we have demand in the community. You've mentioned that several times. Clearly we have a desire and a need for this. So I think it's kind of a question of, okay, what happens next and how do we do it? I don't think the timing could be better to be having this discussion, especially from the way things work around here, city standpoint. We've got our budget hearings coming up. We're gonna have a lot of discussions about things like this as we talk about that. Then that really, as a council, we start the goal setting process really in May. So start thinking about this from a city of Dubuque standpoint as a city council. In May, those of us sitting up here are going to have the opportunity to start thinking whether this makes it as a goal and priority from the city side. And that leads us into the conversation that's a larger community conversation, which I'll get to because you put an exclamation point behind funding there, and that's kind of the biggest question in the room here when we really talk about it. All right, questions? I'm sure we've got them. Yes, Mr. Resnick.
Thank you. Again, as the mayor said, thank you for all their great data and ideas. The public input really matches my experience and probably most of the experience here that the public, Dubuque, really would love to have some indoor facilities, sports facilities for us to use. And the economic impact is great. They would like to use it themselves too. So that's great. It's for us, and it's also to bring people into the community. My question is about the economic impact numbers that you mentioned. You had several scenarios. So is that money spent directly, or do you have this direct, indirect, and induced effects with multipliers? Is that all part of a formula, or is that direct money directly coming into the community?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So what we represented there, the total spend, is the direct spend with induced and an indirect, right? And so the analogy that we share is the direct spend would be the spend for renting the court at the facility. The indirect would be that they went to the local pizza place and now their revenues are up because of, if not but for, that tournament. And the induced would be the waitress or waiter that is now getting more tips because of the volume of visitation has increased, if not but for. So that's just kind of an analogy on how that all.
Well, that makes sense because we have some great pizza places here. So that's
My
great.
Chicago
So
in me, sorry.
are these numbers that you're putting into the equation, are they standard formulas, or are there something that's for your company?
Yeah, there's multipliers that are regional in nature. So they're county-based multipliers. In-plan is a nationally recognized metric that is used for that sort of a derivative of that initial direct spend number. So we build that direct spend as based off of average spend per person, the number of people that are coming, the origin of where they're coming, and the length of stay.
So I didn't know if that's part of the special sauce you were talking about at the beginning.
It's not that special, but yeah.
Well, I mean, because you do have things that your company does that other companies don't do, and you have a success rate for prediction, or you have a
So we've getting asked that quite a bit, in particular when it's if there's a bonding of some sort. So traditionally and historically, we're at about a 10% variance one way or the other. So we feel pretty good about that. We are predicting the future, so it's not. Would be silly if I stood here and said we are 100%. But
right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Who's next? Yeah, Ms. Farber.
So speaking of special sauce, I do believe that part of our special sauce is the ice arena. And so I was quite pleased to see that that was the phase one. And I think it is niche. I think that the opportunity to have one or two sheets at the same time is just really exponentially positive for the city of Dubuque. And very much look forward to further understanding how this can get articulated and actually developed. But I do have a question. I went back to your other document that you shared with us, and toward the very, very end, you were kind enough to talk about some of the funding strategies. And you were very generic about funding mechanisms, if you will. You talked about all kinds of bonds. You talked about other kind of naming rights. And then the opportunities for what the tax revenue would be based upon that. Could you just articulate and share with us just a little bit about what your thoughts were, and if you had any priorities as to where we would potentially look first?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll share sort of what we elaborated in the report as what we would see sort of on a national, sort of the standard mechanisms that are used. Relative to your market, we did not do necessarily a deeper dive into that in terms of what thresholds you may have, and just from a standpoint of how these are typically funded, hotel, motel tax, right? Whether or not it's, in various communities, all that could be earmarked already, or there's only a percentage left. And so you really need to understand sort of what the threshold or viability that could actually support. One of the things that we are seeing, a lot of these are going in the form of a public-private partnership. I would say historically they're at the back of public entities sort of leading that initiative, but there are some opportunities, and there seems to be a lot of local organizations that are eager for this opportunity as well. So I think that should certainly be part of that funding. I think the state's had some initiatives in the past. We've done a lot of work here in the state of Iowa in terms of I forget the name of the Iowa Reinvestment Act. I think it may have sunsetted already, but there is, we believe that was an opportunity in terms of from a state funding standpoint. So that looks at more of a regional economic impact type facility, which this would be. So you can kind of earmark some of those dollars back to the project. So those are some of the standards, if you will, that we've seen in these types of facilities nationally, but we have not really took a deep dive at all in this regard.
Okay, well, the good news is that you've given us some options to consider. And then I have a little bit more on the special sauce that we talked about here. I think the input from the stakeholders is part of our special sauce, and also the infrastructure development that we have concurrently going on with our hotels and some of the other infrastructure, not only on the island, but in the Millwork and also in the downtown Dubuque. So I think that we are beginning to have that initial step, if you will, that would support this kind of development. So I'm just really excited, and a very thorough presentation. And again, the research was just outstanding. So thank you very much. And it gives us really an initial start that I think is quite encouraging.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, Mr. Jones, go ahead.
Haven't really got anything to add except my thanks again to the DRA and the Q for putting this together and for sharing it with the whole community. Of course, the DRA would have an interest in something happening on Schmidt Island, and that may have gotten us thinking that we should pay for this study. But their greater interest is having it happen in the community, and that speaks pretty highly to the reach of the DRA. The other thing I want to say to the citizens that are watching, remember you can go to cityofdubuque.org and watch the video of this presentation anytime to refresh you or to get you ideas, because we'd like to have something like this happen. I'm pretty sure every one of us has at one time or another said, this is great. We also know that we haven't got any kind of financial resources to make it happen without really reaching or really dreaming or really shaking the trees. So this is going to require a community effort. It's going to require some group to take the lead and say, we're going to raise some private money, or we're going to find a private partner that wants to do this. And that's why we're here tonight, to share the story that the DRA spent some serious dollars to show the community, yes, we can. So we've got to get that spirit shared with a lot of us in the community and see if we just can't do it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. This side, Mr. Sprank.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Wonderful presentation, a lot of good information. I really like the last slides about the costs, so folks are aware of how much this is potentially going to cost. Because I know a number of citizens, particularly the hockey groups, that have reached out to me that would love a second sheet of ice. So even when I did my own investigation and talking to them over these last few years, basically they love the Imon facility because it's a very nice facility, and even some of the facilities you've mentioned are like, they're not so nice. So they're very nice. They're appreciative of the Dubuque facility in particular. So I'm looking forward to us figuring out how we can make that happen, as figuring out finding the money. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, Ms. Rousseau.
Thank you. I liked the focus that you could bring to us in this as far as the importance of being regional, the focus on the ice and so low-hanging fruit. One of the comments that I think it was you that made, you said with a higher caliber of facility, I thought you said that the costs may be more than people are used to with the kind of facilities that we have now. So my question for you is, the families that will use this facility, can they be just an average family, or is this just for affluent families, or do your statistics kind of give you some insights into who actually use those kind of facilities?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think, relative to sort of that funding analysis, I think, in my opinion, that's sort of the heart of that next step is really to dive in deeper and understand the price elasticity here locally. What we did here and what we know is that they're renting facilities here below market average. Not to say that what we're proposing is only for affluent families, one of the things that we've seen done elsewhere is that, especially if there's a public-private partnership or a city-run, there's an opportunity to sort of do a discounted for a community or a resident user group, if you will, and that's all part of that sort of funding analysis and business planning around this. So there are opportunities to really sort of leverage the unique financing and business plan around this to make sure that it is something that will be used and affordable and attainable from the local community standpoint.
So it sounds like something that should be thought about right at the very beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Bethel.
A lot of my questions have been answered. I do want to thank your hard work. Those 111 pages are pretty impressive. So you really did a lot of detail-oriented. You looked at us as a community, what we currently pay for gym space and those kind of things. That's That's really helpful and personal for us, so thank you. The DRA and the generosity of Dubuque Initiatives for providing us and the residents of Dubuque this important work. It's really just a great partnership when we talk about already having partnerships. I don't want to get past all of this without saying the why. I work in healthcare, and so when we think about the why, just a couple of things. Centers for Disease Control reports suicide as the third leading cause of death in adolescents, and advocates participation in sports for its positive psychologic benefits. The CDC also did a youth risk behavior survey demonstrating frequent vigorous activity reduces the risk of feelings of hopelessness, suicide in both males and females, in addition to physical benefits of exercise, social acceptance, and team building. So there's a number of residents who are watching right now who this doesn't affect their family. And when we talk about spending tens of millions of dollars, I want them to know that there's validity for our next generations and moving forward in what this would provide our community. Very important work. And we've talked about brain health initiatives and those things in our community. This is part of that, that wellness measure. A couple of things that I was really interested in: the Appleton model, the expensive model, but I'm interested to know, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but I didn't see that any of those were funded by a city referendum.
I believe actually Appleton may have been a part of it. So Appleton's a really unique one. That was 19 various communities that come together and dedicated their hotel tax. So that is sort of a little bit of an inverse of what we're suggesting here. That is a tourism first. So their major driver is bringing nothing but tournaments to increase a certain threshold of regional room nights, because that obviously feeds back to what was funding that endeavor. So that was a collection of communities rather that helped fund that overall development through hotel tax.
Okay, all right, thank you. Just, one other thought I had in reading this, and I appreciate the look at both the tourism side and the economic benefit for our community, but I want our residents, as we've said, to benefit as well. So 10 years ago in Dubuque, my then third grade daughter would practice until 8 p.m. at night in order to find a hard surface. Now my third grade son only practices till 7:15 at night to find a hard surface. And it's dicey in trying to schedule that for volunteer coaches in our community who are there giving of their time and their effort. And so I'm really proud that our costs are low. And as we would move forward with this model, I want to make sure that these, as Ms. Roussel mentioned, that these are attainable for our own community as it comes to weekday and week evening planning. So just a couple of my thoughts. I am disappointed 84% of our community in the survey thinks we are not serving them the way we need to, so we need to act on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone for comments, and thanks again for the presentation. Oh, Mike, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's all right.
You opened up with some really important remarks, and I want to reinforce and repeat those.
Please.
This was not a study commissioned by the city of Dubuque. It is not a study to create a project for the city of Dubuque. This is purely an informational session. This was commissioned by the DRA, and that's a great thing, but all it is information. So there was a lot of language tonight about even some words like "we need to do this" and things like that. That's not tonight. In October, you'll have a goal-setting session. Maybe this will make the list. Maybe it won't. But all it is tonight is an information session.
Thanks for the reminder. I think it's an important one, and it is. And there's a couple things that I want to add to that before we close here. So when we have discussions like this about really big things, it is important that we recognize both the dreams and the constraints and what those mean. It's time to dream. I mean, it absolutely is. It's time to think big about this and figure out what we could pull off as a community. There is a serious desire for something like what was described tonight to happen in Dubuque and to be here. I hope that what we can do as a community is think about this creatively and think about what can we do at Schmidt Island, what can we do in other places, what could we do from a standpoint of us together working as taxpayers to use our own tax funds to be able to pay for something like this? What could we do as organizations or private developers? I mean, how can we all work together to make this happen? Bottom line is, I think it's the realistic notion here is that this is going to have to be some sort of a partnership. I think that the possibility that our city could fund this through something like a referendum is a bit far-fetched in the current environment. I'm just going to say that out loud. I think it's important that we think about this in its full scope. There's a couple things I want to say, not to be a downer about this, but I want to make sure that we all recognize it, and then I know that we have to close things out here. This is a really tough environment we're in currently. We're not going to get any help from our federal government on something like this for the next few years, most likely. Based on the information that we know now, I just don't see it coming. I don't think we're going to get much at that level. I think once things level out, I don't think that recreational facilities and things like that are going to make it to the top of the priority list for our federal government. I could be wrong, and that'd be great, but I think that's kind of likely what we're looking at now. Our state of Iowa have been great partners for a lot of these projects. I'm not so sure for the next 4 years or so we're going to see a whole lot of state of Iowa funds flowing in this direction either, in large amounts, large enough to be able to build something like this outright. Maybe some assistance to help with it, but I don't think we're going to see, we're kind of in a tax cutting environment, and I think that's something we need to recognize. Outside of government, we're also in a pretty difficult environment. We're hearing a lot about costs rising dramatically and making development hard, making it difficult to make something like this work. We're hearing about the loan environment from the banking sector starting to constrict and tighten a little bit because everybody's getting a bit nervous about how things are working, and it's just a challenge out there. I'm not saying this in a way to try to blame any. Oh, and I should also mention the cost of things is just higher. Everything costs more. I'm not saying any of this to blame any one of us or any group or entity or anything like that. I'm just saying it is what it is, and it's kind of what we have to live with. So as we're dreaming and thinking about this, I think we also need to be realistic about how fast we want it. If we as a community want something like this, we're going to need to think about how to get it done, and we're probably going to have to think about how to get it done in phases. I think what you heard from us tonight is we want to play a role as a city council, and I think as a city, we're not done having this discussion. I think Mike makes some really good points, but we've been talking about this a lot lately, and I think that we're going to keep doing it, at least the city council that's sitting here before you. So I do think that's going to be a part of our discussion. But as we have that discussion, I think we're also recognizing that we're going to need help as your representatives to get this done from a private sector too. So all of us need to work together to do something like this if we want it. I think it's totally possible. I don't think we should say that it's not. I think we should totally go for it, but and go for the discussion and figure out what we want to do. But it's going to take a lot of us working together and putting some smart heads to think about this to be able to get it done. It's a great start, though. This is a really good start. I mean, we've got some really good information to work with. I'm very happy with the presentation and the fact that we got to have this as a community. We've got some good public participation here and folks showing up to listen to this. I know a lot of other folks have listened to it before, and probably a lot other that will be out there reading about it. So thanks again for the time tonight. We appreciate you being here, and I think we are done for now, so we will be adjourned until 6:30.
Thank you all.